Welcome back to this series that covers 11 questions for commercial landscape estimators. My name is Michelle Penz, the Purple Squirrel Consultant. And after deciding to retire in 2022, I discovered that there's really no modern training for commercial landscape estimators. So I wrote a book called An Introduction to Commercial Landscape Estimating. It is available on Amazon for $19.99, and the link to purchase the book is in the description below. This is the 6th video of my 11 video series, and in today's video, we're going to talk about risk management. So what is the definition of risk management? Risk management is the practice of forecasting and evaluating financial risks together with the identification of procedures and processes to avoid or minimize the risk's impact. Aside from potential financial risk, it is also important to consider your company's reputation. Because even if you don't suffer financially, if your company develops a reputation for producing projects with bad outcomes, you're going to have a hard time finding work. So as far as risk management goes, what types of risk is involved when you're bidding on contracts and constructing projects? Well, within bidding, the first and the biggest one is ambiguous scope. I can't emphasize this enough. If for whatever reason you can't define the elements of a project, and there are a lot of different reasons for that, sometimes it's best to just not bid on the project. The only exception would be in the case of a client, a good client of yours that has a project with ambiguous scope. And sometimes you decide to take the risk because they are a good client. Even if you lose a little money on that project, then that's okay because you're going to probably make it up in the next project. Another thing to consider are inaccessible areas. Sometimes when you're doing work on ponds and native areas, for instance, they're in ecologically sensitive areas. And so as a result, especially if the Army Corps of Engineers is involved, they have very strict processes on how you access those areas. They limit, for instance, the weight of the equipment and the type of equipment that can be used. And sometimes you have to do things like put substrates like plywood and such down to protect the soil in those areas so that it doesn't get torn up. So accessibility is really something to consider when you're working on those types of projects. Another thing to consider are tight bid deadlines. Tight bid deadlines often result in errors and omissions in your bidding, in your proposal. And when that happens, now you've got a problem when it's time for the contract to be written up. If you've missed specifications, if you've missed certain other elements of the contract, especially in public work. Public work is notorious for having some ambiguous specifications. Sometimes it's better to just decline the project and not work on it. Another thing to consider is that sometimes a general contractor will contact you with a project that has a tight bid deadline for a couple of reasons. Maybe they forgot about the landscaping portion of the project and now it's an emergency and they need a bid right away. And so now the pressure is on you to give them a bid that is complete when you may or may not have all of the information. So that's something to consider. Another thing to consider with general contractors is sometimes they don't have anybody to bid on a project, especially a public project, because usually with a public project, there's a hard bid date. And if people don't have time to do it, that contractor may have nobody to bid on the landscaping portion of the project. And again, you have to use your judgment on that. Perhaps they're a client of yours, you're going to help them out of a tight spot, and you can work together to get that bid done in that tight time frame. Another thing to think about is tight timelines on the actual project that have monetary damages. And again, this is a case that happens with public work often. When you look at the specifications, sometimes you'll see that if you miss deadlines that you're responsible for monetary damages. So if you combine that with a tight bid deadline and now you're also having to deal with monetary damages, perhaps it's best to decline that working on that bid. Another thing to consider are vendors. You don't necessarily want to go with the lowest cost quote when you do your request for quotes. A good example is retaining walls. Retaining walls can be very expensive and complex. So you want to work with a vendor that you know has the expertise to advise you on the retaining wall and to provide you with a very complete quote for it. That's absolutely critical. Now, if you get 3 quotes and you get a vendor that you've never worked with before, and it's a big complex wall, maybe you put that quote aside. You don't use them this time, but perhaps on the next project it's a little bit smaller, it has a very small little wall, maybe you give them a try, and now you have 2 good retaining wall vendors. That's a good approach to that. Another thing to consider are vendors with poor reputations. Once you're in the industry, you get a pretty good idea of who is good to work with and who is not, and you just pretty much want to stay away from vendors with not great reputations because it will affect your reputation. With contracts, you want to make sure that all the elements of your contract are documented in the contract, including exclusions if you can get them to do it. A good example is soil. For instance, for ponds, if the ponds require biossoil, which is extremely expensive, and you're excluding that, make sure that that's in the contract, because you don't want to be on the hook for that if you weren't including that in your dollar amount for that soil. Another good example of undocumented changes to a contract are substitutions. Substitutions are very important to document thoroughly. Make sure you get all of your approvals on substitutions. And like I always say, document, document, document. Make sure that you save emails of approvals, for instance, for substitutions, especially when it comes to the municipality, because what happens often with municipalities and with general contractors, the nature of those positions is very transient. So you may get a verbal approval from one of those entities, and then that person leaves the company, and then months and sometimes even years later, somebody comes back and says, hey, did you get an approval for this substitution? And if you don't have it in writing, that becomes a problem. So as far as risk management goes, that's really the bottom line. You really want to document everything and make it very concrete. And sometimes it's worth it just to walk away from the project, to not even bid on it. That's the best case scenario. You don't want to leave in the middle of a project. You don't want to ideally say you're going to bid on a project and then scrub it later, because then that puts the general contractor in a bad spot, especially for public work, because they have a hard bid date. And if it's a good client, check with your supervisor. Sometimes you'll look at it and go, okay, well, we're going to take the risk and we'll make it up on the next project if we lose money. But those are all things to consider with risk management. Thank you for watching this video. If you found value in this information, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. Feel free to ask me questions in the comments below. And if you have any interest in training or consulting, you can contact me at my email address in the description below. Please join me for the 7th video, How Do You Manage Workflow, next week. Thank you. Bye now.